Tonight on Nation to Nation, opponents of Kinder Morgan build what they hope is a barrier to pipeline expansion.
To watch out for, I'll use the word enemies they're coming into our territory, they're threatening our land and our resources and our waters. So the significance of this watch house is most important to us in doing this work of stopping Kinder Morgan.
Crown Indigenous Relations Minister Carolyn Bennett announced it'll negotiate claims of student-on-student abuse. A Dalhousie professor says this type of abuse went on a lot.
But generally, we were told that bullying, kind of emotional, physical bullying, was something that was pervasive every day, that was kind of normal within the schools.
And the overrepresentation of Indigenous women in prison was presented in New York by a Manitoba justice advocate.
I feel that it's a crisis right now, especially in Manitoba, where we have the number of incarcerated people is rising, and this doesn't seem to be getting any better.
Hello, I'm Todd Lamoran, and welcome to Nation. Last weekend, the effort to stop the Kinder Morgan pipeline expansion in British Columbia had its biggest protest yet. Thousands showed up to rally against a plan to triple the amount of bitumen exported through Burrard Inlet. First Nations are leading the way, and one tactic has been to build tiny houses on the pipeline's proposed route. This past weekend, one was built near Kinder Morgan's tank farm in Burnaby. William George is a member of the Tsleil-Waututh Nation and spokesman for the group Protect the Inlet. He is currently manning what is being called a watch house. Here are some sights and sounds from last weekend's protest.
These are tactics we used centuries ago. We had watch house locations to monitor maybe threats coming our way, and we see Kinder Morgan as an ultimate threat.
Kinder Morgan's got to go. Hey, hey, ho, ho. Kinder Morgan's got to go. Hey, hey, ho, ho. Kinder Morgan's got to go.
And as I was coming over the mountain, I live in Seashell. And I was coming over the mountain, I said to the Creator, we're going to have a great day. And we did. And I hope we continue this thing to the point where we do stop Kinder Morgan.
Welcome to Nation, Mr. George.
Hello, hey, thanks for being here with me today.
What is the historical context of a watch house?
This structure that we put up here has always been very important to us, in strategic locations, just to watch out for, I'll use the word enemies they're coming into our territory, they're threatening our land and our resources and our waters. So the significance of this watch house is most important to us in doing this work of stopping Kinder Morgan.
And how many people are there now? I mean, is there somebody there 24/7?
Yeah, well, I am here 24/7, absolutely, and I have a good team of people behind me, some brotherhoods, sisterhoods that come visit me, and we do ceremonies in this watch house to maintain the spirituality and the culture of what we're doing.
In addition to that, Mr. George, what else are you doing there as far as the watch house goes? We have a good team. We're paying attention to the politics in behind this, so we're in clear communication, with my elders, spiritual leaders around, what's going on here, with injunctions and placing this right on top of the pipeline here. So, we have gatherings and, talks about this. So, our daily events are just, us communicating on what's coming our way and, and how we're to react in that way. So, you mentioned you mentioned that injunction. You're actually just 2 meters beyond the 50-meter exclusion zone set by that injunction. So, what worries are there of you actually being arrested?
You know what, like the way I see it around this injunction is we erected the spiritual structure here, and it just goes to show they're still scared of our spirituality, they're scared of our culture. This is where people were, in residential school, thrown out of windows, driven over by cars and vehicles. They're still scared of our spirituality and our culture.
Now, I heard there was a cry to warrior up. How far would you go to stop Kinder Morgan?
Well, you know, that's I said that, you know, a few years ago, you know, warring up, and, you know, I'm very proud to be that person to be warring up today.
And what does that mean, I suppose, in a day-to-day, what can you do to, I suppose, stop any further construction in the future?
So, again, for me, what's most important is, you know, having the support of my elders and spiritual leaders and conducting our culture and you know, going back to prayer and keeping it very sacred that way. That's why this, all this is happening and brought together. We've been in ceremony from, you know, working hard on this for 2 months. So, you know, taking back the ceremony in our culture, and that's how we're going to maintain this camp.
Of course, stopping the pipeline could mean more bitumen is shipped by rail. I know there was a big derailment in Northern Ontario about 3 years ago, and the nearby First Nation was advised not to drink the water. So if you stop the pipeline, won't the problem just simply be spread out?
Okay. So, yeah, I'm going to pass on that answer, Todd. Sorry.
I'm sorry?
I'm going to have to pass on that question.
You don't want to answer that question?
Yeah. You know, well, you know how I can answer that question for you is, you know, for 18 years I cleaned windows in high-rises, and, you know, just a few months ago I've been asked to do this. So, you know, as far as the politics go and stopping the pipeline and rails, you know, what's most important to me is I've been asked to do this, and, you know, by stepping away and walking away from my career for 18 years and strictly focus on this, that's my main concern here.
Okay, Mr. George, I want to thank you then for talking to me about this.
Okay, thank you, Todd.
Coming up, we talked to a Dalhousie professor about the student-on-student abuse that happened at residential schools. Welcome back to Nation to Nation. Earlier this week, Crown Indigenous Relations Minister Carolyn Bennett made an announcement about the independent assessment process. Those who made complaints about being abused by other students and had their cases dismissed or felt they were undercompensated may be eligible for a renegotiated settlement. However, the federal government estimates that would only affect 240 people. Amy Bombay is an assistant professor at Dalhousie University in Halifax. She has researched student-on-student abuse at residential school. Dr. Bombay was in Ottawa to give a talk on the long-term health effects caused by the residential school experience.
It's important to think about the root causes of these issues, which is colonization. And Indian residential schools was one major aspect of colonization that continues to contribute to the long-term health issues and health inequities that we continue to see today.
Joining me now is Dr. Bombay. Welcome to Nation to Nation.
Glad to be here.
First off, what did you think of the federal government's announcement earlier this week that they're going to renegotiate student-on-student abuse claims?
Yeah, for me, I was pleasantly surprised to hear that. I did a report on the issue of student-to-student abuse that came out in 2014, and I hadn't really heard anything much since, and so I was really glad to hear that this is being addressed.
Maybe it was your report that changed your mind, who knows?
Hope so.
Though they only mentioned 240 eligible candidates are going to be renegotiated, it seems kind of low, especially based on the research I'd looked at. So how pervasive was student-on-student abuse during residential schools?
Yeah, so our report looked at that, and the way we did that is we asked service providers. So we didn't talk to residential school survivors directly, mainly because this was really the first research that had been done, and we didn't want to traumatize, and we didn't know enough about it. But generally, we were told that bullying, kind of emotional, physical bullying, was something that was pervasive every day, that was kind of normal within the schools. And then when it comes to things like sexual abuse, that wasn't described as an everyday phenomenon for every student, but it was described as relatively common in many schools.
Did you find it surprising through the independent assessment process that this didn't become more of a factor when trying to make those settlements?
Yeah, that's when it started kind of coming out in the news and during the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, these stories of student-to-student abuse that hadn't really been spoken about kind of in the larger dialogue around the residential school system. And I think, and our research shows there are many reasons for that, but the IEP, the way it worked was they actually, in order to get compensated, you have to name your survivors. And so I think that was, our research shows that was a key factor. People didn't feel comfortable naming the other students who survived, who abused them. They were still living in the same communities. And so definitely, I think probably a lot of people didn't disclose that abuse in their IEP claims.
Now, why did this happen, I suppose, I guess is a key question.
Yeah, so I think the important takeaway of our kind of report on the issue is that this is actually an expected outcome to the terrible experience of the residential school system. When you look at other contexts, just in kind of other types of residential schools, like in England and stuff, where you don't even have that added racial kind of slant to it, you see that peer abuse is very common. And then it's even more promoted in contexts of severe trauma, of chronic trauma, of being exposed to role models. And also, we found that all of students who went to school and who abused others, their parents had previously gone to residential school. So there was already a kind of, an intergenerational transmission happening that, and then, generations of students were going to school. This was normalized and then coming back into community. So it also had long-term outcomes as well.
What were some of the specific reasons that you found out in your report that students abused other students?
So in some cases, there was stories of bullying. Students were hungry. We know there was widespread malnutrition. So there's stories of students stealing other people, younger and smaller kids' food because they're hungry. So for a lot of people, it was a survival thing. We were also told stories where the priests and the staff who abused students actually forced other students to abuse others as a kind of way to have control over them. So there was explicit, forcing students to do that. And also we know just from research in non-Indigenous contexts that children who are exposed to chronic childhood adversity, that does promote aggression in general and acting out. And that acting out in that way is kind of a normal response to such terrible trauma.
What were some of the short-term effects and long-term effects of having to go under this type of abuse?
Yeah, so that was one of the questions our book looked at was there some unique effects of the student abuse versus being abused by staff? And what we found was that where being abused by staff was kind of associated with a lot of, mistrust towards white people, abuse by other students kind of left people with trusting no one. A lot of students, a lot of the care providers described to us of their clients describing going to school, kind of being scared, but feeling that they should be able to trust their peers. And then when they didn't get that trust, that was, that support, and instead were abused, that really kind of had an extra kind of negative, or a unique kind of negative outcome in terms of influencing their personal relationships in the long term and in the short term.
Something I found interesting, again, watching your talk from a couple of years ago is if you're one generation removed, it was bad, but if you're two generations removed from somebody who went to residential school, it was even worse. There was even greater risk of trauma. Why was that? Yeah,
so do you mean the more generations in the one family?
Well, if your parents went, there was greater risk. If your parents and grandparents went, there was even greater risk.
Yeah, that's been put forth kind of in the literature, this concept of historical trauma, and it suggests that all of these aspects of residential schooling and other aspects of colonization and the negative effects actually accumulate across generations. And so even within the residential school system, several generations of children went. So our research does support that theory, and we showed that the more generations in your family went, the greater the risk. So that it's just, that trauma gets passed on, and then sometimes it accumulates unless there's something that's intervening to stop that transmission of these negative outcomes.
Of course, there's going to be another settlement for a few hundred students. We've had an apology. The Aboriginal Healing Foundation has come and gone. And I'm sure the settlement probably won't get rid of this trauma. It's just going to be a bit of compensation. I guess at this point, what can be done to try and stop that trauma and this intergenerational trauma?
Yeah, I think I actually just came from the release of the latest regional health survey, and I was presenting on the most recent statistics on the proportion of the population that's been affected by a residential school, and also the long-term impacts on the children and grandchildren and on survivors. And there's still about 15% of the First Nations adult population who attended residential schools. So, this idea that this is kind of dealt with and we don't have to do anymore is really not accurate. There's still so much more healing that needs to be done. And we actually some of our evidence is showing that the effects are actually greater in the children and grandchildren. And the effects seem to be manifesting even greater in our youth. And so I think there's really a need for continued healing to address residential schools, also the 60 scoop, and the continued, all of these things together I think would make a lot of sense. And there's still a huge need for something like the Aboriginal Healing Foundation.
Well, I guess it'll be up to the federal and provincial governments to see if they're going to get on board with something like that. Dr. Bombay, thank you for appearing on Nation to Nation.
Thanks for having me.
One more break, and we talk to someone who presented today at the United Nations Commission on the Status of Women in New York. Welcome back to Nation to Nation. For the rest of this week and next week, the United Nations Commission on the Status of Women is having its 62nd gathering in New York, where a host of issues are being discussed. One of them, at a morning session, was at the overrepresentation of Indigenous women in prison. Chantell Barker works as a Community Justice Development Coordinator for the Southern Chiefs Organization in Manitoba. She gave a short talk this morning.
I was employed with Manitoba Justice for 10 years. And what I say now is I went behind enemy lines. I got to see the people in all of the different correctional centers across Manitoba. And in Manitoba, we have the highest amount of Indigenous people incarcerated. And the stats say 75%, but my eyes, my heart, and my mind says it's more like 90%. I've been through every one of the women's, the youth, the federal, the provincial, and who did I see there? I see my people.
Joining me now is Chantell Barker. Welcome to Nation, Ms. Barker.
Hello.
Now, if you can just give me what were some of the key points of your presentation this morning?
This morning we discussed the overrepresentation, but also my background when I was with Manitoba Justice and going into the different correctional centers in Manitoba, and how and working with Indigenous people that were in those correctional centers and the impacts that it has had on colonization and residential school has had on them. So I talked about that, and I talked about how there was a need for cultural programming, because that's, from my experience, that's what's impacting and working for Indigenous people, is the cultural piece, is knowing their identity, knowing their culture, knowing their history, and how they've been impacted by intergenerational impacts, but also understanding and providing them with tools on how to heal and move forward from those impacts, so that they can start becoming, so they can not go back into the correctional centers.
Why did you feel you had to go down to New York to give this presentation?
I feel that it's a crisis right now, especially in Manitoba, where we have the number of incarcerated people is rising, and this doesn't seem to be getting any better. So, for example, when I first started off in justice, my average caseload was around 25 to 27, and when I left Manitoba Justice, my average caseload was around 90 to 100. So within a 10-year span of being with Manitoba Justice, it almost tripled.
In fact, in your presentation, you mentioned that you had been behind enemy lines, I believe is the line. Why did you feel you had to say that?
Because I needed to know. So what I did was I found out how that system works, what the tools that were used in the justice system, like the risk assessments, the Gladue reports, the pre-sentence reports. And so I really got an inside view of how all of the dynamics and the mechanics of the justice system and how it's not working for Indigenous people. So once I got that knowledge and that training and that expertise, then I was able to leave Manitoba Justice, and because now I know how their system works and what they're looking for to rehabilitate people. Now at Southern Chiefs organization, I'm going to bring those skills and utilize our new vision at SCO, which is there is no Indigenous incarcerated people. And so we're using our culture and focusing on healing people, especially through our restorative justice program, so that to prevent them from going into the system, because I think prevention is very key, as well as education in preventing people from going into the system.
A lot of people put a hope in beefing up Sections 81 and 84 of the Strategic Plan for Aboriginal Corrections, which came out over 2 decades ago. What do you think of that?
I'm still waiting for it to be implemented. I have not from what I know, I haven't seen any implementation of it, especially in Manitoba. So I'm not too sure about what the other provinces are doing, but I know that in Manitoba, that they're not being implemented.
Parliamentary committee right now is looking at the overrepresentation of Indigenous women in prison. It's being done by the status of women. Do you foresee anything coming out of that when they finally get around to doing a report?
Well, I'm hopeful. Like, we have to be hopeful, especially with truth and reconciliation. But it's very important that we all come together as equals at the table, and that we're consulted. Indigenous people are consulted in order to implement those recommendations in that report, and that it gets recognition from all the different levels of government.
Of course, there's been a lot of reports about this issue. I've seen quite a few just in my time here in Ottawa, which has just been over a year. The latest was the Macdonald-Laurier Institute report that graded the provinces on justice issues. Do we need more reports, or do we have enough there that it just needs to be implemented?
Yes, we have many reports starting from the Aboriginal Justice Inquiry that was written many, many years ago, and we're still waiting for the implementation of those recommendations. And as you look at the different reports and to see the patterns, the recommendations are so very similar. So I don't think we need another report. I think there's many reports in place where there are recommendations that can be used to make a difference and to try to change the justice system.
Finally, how do you think your presentation and the presentations of your colleagues down there went over with an international audience there in New York?
I think it really went well. I was very honored to sit with the representation that was at the table, and I know just from sitting with them and meeting with them beforehand that their hearts are in it, and they really want to see change. So I'm hoping that this recognition will wake up and will wake up the different levels of government, so that we can start implementing these changes right away and not waiting for another 10, 20 years and we're just sitting on a desk collecting dust again.
Well, let's hope something happens, because it can't get any worse, or maybe it can. Ms. Barker, thank you for talking to me today.
Yeah, no problem. Thank you for inviting me.
Next week, our political panel of MPs will be back in action here in Ottawa. And if you missed any part of tonight's show, you can check out our podcasts. Go to aptnnews.ca/podcast. I'm Todd Lamoran. Have a great evening.